hit start.
Okay, we have started. Sorry for the slight delay, but welcome everybody at our second WMUG Tuesday. The webinar we are actually organizing because of the COVID-19 crisis. We are not able to meet on premises, and therefore we have started to organize WMUG webinars each Tuesday for now. Today is our second WMUG Tuesday, and today we have the pleasure to have Michael van Horenbeeck, all the way from Belgium, and he will tell us about Microsoft 365 security in the real world. We cannot organize these kind of events without sponsors, so a big thanks to our sponsors. The sponsors help us to fly over speakers when needed and when organizing mainly on-premises events, but we really appreciate their help. For next week, we have Michael van Horenbeeck. Mirko will talk about desktop analytics, and if you want to join, the URL is displayed below, but and you can then subscribe on the page, and you will get all the details needed to access the webinar next week at the same time. Further, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter. We have a website which redirects to our meetup group. So if you go to www.wmug.nl, you will actually end up in our meetup page. Well, take a look at our social media, and if you use our hashtag, it's WMUG_NL on Twitter. That's very much appreciated. I will now give the stage to Michael. I hope you're ready, and good luck.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and good afternoon. First of all, Peter, thanks for having me and inviting me to speak to the WMUG user group here today. It's always a pleasure to do so. And today I will be talking about, guess what, security. It's one of my favorite topics, and I'll let you in on a little secret. If you endure with me until the end of the presentation, I might have a little surprise for you, but I won't spoil by telling what it is just yet. So today I'm going to talk to you about M365 security in the real world. But what does that actually mean, the real world? Well, you know, as you've been, or if you've been in IT as long as I have, then chances are that you've dealt with salespeople. Not just salespeople in general, but Microsoft salespeople. And, you know, for better or worse, I have no problem with them because Microsoft is mainly one of the reasons why I have a job. But, you know, salesy people tend to sell stuff in a certain way, right? And then there is reality. So you sometimes have a disconnect between what technology is supposed to do and what reality gives you, or, you know, what technology is intended for and how it's actually used in the real world. And today I want to walk through, you know, the whole M365 ecosystem with you, and kind of look at, you know, from my perspective, having seen different environments, you know, what works, what doesn't work, what's used, what's not used, why isn't it used, why should people be using it? So more look at it from, you know, a case by case, a feature by feature basis, and see how we can actually leverage a lot of the components, and maybe look into the things that are underutilized, at least in my eye, at this point in time. Right, and one of the things that that really stuck with me, it's a quote, maybe you know Douglas Adams, who said, you know, we're stuck with technology when what we really want is just stuff that works. He's the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a very humoristic guy, but at the same time, you know, that quote in itself kind of depicts the eternal battle that, you know, pretty much any customer have. You can come in and talk about technology all you want, but You might be talking to an IT manager, you might be talking to a technical guy, and they might be interested in the bits and pieces. But at the end of the day, looking at a business itself, they don't care as much about the fact that the feature is called Azure ATP or Defender ATP or whatever, right? They just want solutions. They want something that works, that just works regardless of how you do it. If you do it in a cost-effective, great way, and it meets the requirements, and it does what it needs to do, and it just works, then you've done something. And that's a philosophy that really sticks with me, not just in technology, right? Not just in security, but basically everything we do, right? I encounter a lot of people in IT or beyond IT that tend to focus on technology, right? I'll give you an example. Recently, I was talking to someone, and we were talking about antivirus, or EDR, really. And they were hell-bent on a specific product. They said, we need this product. And start the question, why, right? Yeah, because it's a great product. Well, that's not really a reason to implement a product. So why do you need that product, right? Long story short, it basically came down to focusing on the technology rather than the solution, right? So you can't build solutions if you don't know what the problem is. You can't solve a solution. You can't help someone if you don't know what you need to do. It's kind of like going through the hospital and just putting a band-aid somewhere just because it's a fancy, yellow band-aid. Look, I've got a yellow band-aid, but my arm didn't hurt. So what good is it? Maybe it's better because now you're protected from other stuff. And in cybersecurity, in security in general, having more protection obviously is better. The more layers you can build, the better it is. The more protected you are, the better it is. So there is a certain ratio, right, where doing something, whether you need it or not, still is better than doing nothing. But at the same time, it's worth looking at what do you really need and what do you really need to deploy, right? So when I look at cybersecurity and I look at the capabilities and features, whether it's Microsoft features or solutions or from another vendor, I basically take all the information I get and I've got two buckets: useful, not useful, great, not great, works, doesn't work. And then I just throw stuff in those buckets and I see whatever I've left in my useful bucket, and I start working with that. And despite the platform play, right, which if you take a look at the whole M365 ecosystem, there is a huge amount of capabilities. You'll notice that people in general, not just me, do the same thing, and you get a natural segregation between popular features and the ones that exist to cross off the list somewhere, a checklist to mark some compliance, to appease to someone's opinion, and then move on. In itself, that feature that you've thrown away in the thumbs down bucket may actually be a useful something. It may actually solve a certain specific problem, but it doesn't necessarily become a really popular something, nor is it something that you should focus on. So what I want to do now is, I've got this massive slide with buttons all over the place, and I want to take a look at each and every one of these capabilities, which, in my view, and I may have left out one or two here and there, are all geared towards management, right, or security, or in either way contribute to the security posture of an environment, right? Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. You're not sharing anything at the moment, so I knew you were not having that much slides. So.
No, I don't have a lot of slides, and it's interesting that I'm not sharing anymore. So let me try this again. For some reason, it fell off in the go live. So let me know if you can.
And there we go. Yep.
Ah, there we go. So you missed all the previous versions, previous slides, which, for all intents and purposes, you didn't miss much because these were just, beautiful pictures. But anyway, the message is more important than what's on screen, but this one is rather important if you want to follow. So we've got a lot of buttons on screen, each of which represent the security technologies, features, solutions, services that contribute to the security posture of an environment. And I want to go over each and every one of them, kind of briefly explain what is it used for, and then I want to turn them into three categories: used a lot, or at least what I see; not used a lot, maybe for a purpose; and almost not used at all. Right. So looking at the first one there, Microsoft Threat Protection, that's an iffy one, right? Because it's not so much a solution or a feature itself. It's the secret sauce over a combination of capabilities, right? Microsoft Threat Protection, aka the Security Center, security.microsoft.com, if you go there and you enable NTP, it basically will aggregate information from Cloud App Security, Defender ATP, Office ATP, and some identity protection stuff from Azure AD. And it's mainly an operational dashboard, if you will, right? It's an operation center through which you can make some configuration changes in these capabilities, but it's basically following up on alerts, on incidents, and where you can do some of these cross-platform threat hunting capabilities. So I'm just going to go over each and every one of them. Keep that in mind, and then we'll have a discussion on why or why not they may be used. Then there is identity protection, right? And it's not per se the identity protection capabilities itself, it's more identity protection at large. Maybe I should have called this Azure AD, because within Azure AD, there's lots of capabilities that you can use to further protect identities. But looking at the feature called identity protection basically allows you to define what needs to happen when someone authenticates and that authentication is perceived as being risky. Now, in order for an authentication to be perceived risky, there's two things that can happen. Either the conditions contribute to a risky sign-in, and the conditions could be the device someone's using, the location where someone's using, the metadata basically of the authentication, or the account that is being used is exhibiting risky behavior, i.e. it has been flagged as a risky user because the credentials may have leaked somewhere, it has shown or exhibited suspicious behavior before, and then based on the identity protection policy, if you will, you can determine if I've got a sign-in risk equals to low, medium, high, I want to reset the password, force MFA, to require, it's basically a conditional access policy, but specifically on sign-in risk, right? There is some overlap with the conditional access policies in itself, but this is targeted towards the sign-in risk and the user risk itself. Then there's Cloud App Security, right, which jumping from a detailed feature like identity protection to a platform like Cloud App Security is a huge leap, right? But indulge me for a second. So Cloud App Security allows you to take a look at cloud applications. Well, pun intended. It allows you to monitor usage of cloud applications, provided that A, you're logging in using your Azure AD credentials, B, they're connected to Cloud App Security, either through conditional access app control, through an API, or you are ingesting log files from that application into Cloud App Security so that it can reason over log files. So depending on the type of connection you make with Cloud App Security, you've got an inline way of acting, which is through conditional access app policies or conditional access app protection, where it acts as some sort of reverse proxy or proxy, I'd say. Everything goes through Cloud App Security, can reason over what you're doing, and then take a decision like preventing downloads, uploads, verifying the files you're uploading, and so forth. The second method, API connection, actually means that it has native integrations with the platform. For instance, Office 365 is natively integrated with Cloud App Security because there's an API connection between Cloud App Security and Office 365. As such, there's a rich integration. There's lots of data flowing between Office 365 and Cloud App Security so that it can, again, reason over activities that you do, files that are being stored, basically anything that you do within the service. Now, that API connection requires a lot of work on the back end, and as such, your application literally needs to support that and vice versa. Looking at Cloud App Security, there's 15, maybe 20 odd something applications that have backend API connection, or maybe a little less even. And everything else either needs to come from ingesting log files or from an inline proxy capability. Right. Now, how do you get log files into Cloud App Security? Well, first of all, you can log them. You can upload them through a syslog connector if you want to have firewall logs or any other logs flow into Cloud App Security, or you can use what's to the right, Microsoft Defender ATP, Microsoft's next-gen protection EDR solution, right? I'm going to call it an agent, but it's not really an agent, but the components that sit on the operating system obviously have visibility in everything you do, right? As such, Defender ATP, which can run on top of Defender AV, has a lot of data and metrics, not just on what's happening on disk, but also the processes and what you're doing on the network. And then it uploads all of that into Microsoft Defender ATP, the security center. And then through there was basically a backsync that provides that same information to Cloud App Security, where Cloud App Security can use that information to detect what cloud applications are being used, how much data is flowing from those devices to those cloud applications, and so forth and so on. And if time allows, I'll maybe go through the portal later to give you some visuals on that. But again, the story here is a little bit more important than just showing you nice graphics and so forth. Obviously, Defender ATP does more than just uploading data. It allows, through the data that it provides to the cloud service, for it to detect anomalies such as malware doing iffy stuff on the device, an attacker trying to gain credentials from the local authority subsystem. Basically, any attack on the device happening should be able to be detected by Defender ATP through ML, AI, and a bunch of fixed rules. So Azure AD App Proxy, which is not typically something seen as a security feature per se. There's a lot of security related items related to it. First of all, if you need to publish a legacy application or an application to the intranet, then either you open up a firewall port and then inbound through a reverse proxy, but it assumes that you open up a firewall port, you do have reverse proxies that allows access to that application. The Azure AD App Proxy is nothing more or less than a reverse proxy through an outbound connection. So per definition, because there's no inbound connection, it's only an outbound connection, it is more safe. Plus, Azure AD App Proxy, it therefore integrates with all the other capabilities and allows you to have single sign-on based on your Azure AD credentials. Therefore, we have almost, I would say, quote unquote, the panacea in terms of publishing applications. Let's move on. Windows Information Protection. I know it's a long list, right? Windows Information Protection. MAM, I call it the Mobile Application Management Encryption on the Fly for Windows 10. I'll give away this feature. I love it. It is absolutely epic. No one uses it. I don't know why. Like, so many customers I go to see what I'm doing with WIP, and they're like, wow, this is cool. I didn't know we could do this. I'm like, yep, works really well. There's maybe a couple of reasons on why it's not very popular, but basically it allows you to make a distinction between corporate and personal files, and then it can, it can determine which applications can actually consume personal files, corporate files, and which ones can't. So I'll give you an example, right? Through WIP, through Windows Information Protection, you could determine that everything I download from my tenant is corporate data, and therefore should only live or should only be used on devices that are corporate owned, managed, if you will, and applications that are allowed to consume that data. Which means I download a file from SharePoint, I can open it in Word and Excel and PowerPoint and so forth and so on. But once I move into a third-party application, let's say OpenOffice, I can actually prevent OpenOffice from being able to do something with that file. Under the hood, Windows Information Protection uses an encrypted file system to make sure that files, that it can make a distinction between which applications can open that. But just like AppLogger, it requires you to build a list of enlightened applications which can use or consume data, and then a list of applications that shouldn't be using them. There's a lot of work that can go in there. But one of the use cases I love about Windows Information Protection is by downloading or by putting in the right the right policies, you can actually prevent right from within the desktop to upload files to a different tenant, for instance, or into Dropbox. So I have a test policy, right, which I showcase to customers, that everything that's downloaded from my tenant is corporate data, but I've got 3 tenants that I work with, actually 2. I've got my corporate account, I've got my personal tenants, and then within that personal tenant, I've got an account for the user groups. So whenever I take a file from SharePoint or Teams or whatever it is, download it on my device in OneDrive, and I then copy it over into my personal OneDrive for business, which runs on the same device, I can actually copy the file. There's nothing that prevents copying the file from one folder to the other one. But what I'll notice is that file never gets uploaded. Actually, OneDrive tells me, hey, I can't upload the file because I can't access the file. And that is Windows Information Protection making the distinction between which application, which tenant, which network resources should be able to use or consume that corporate data. So in my opinion, really popular feature, but I can tell you, not used a lot. Very unfortunate. Let's go back to the left. Privileged identity management. Hated and loved. I use it everywhere. I hate it as much as I did on day one. Every single time that I need to log on as a global admin, exchange admin, whatever, admin permissions, I need to go through the Azure portal, request access, and then obviously in my own tenant, I've got auto approval ready, but it's a burden to go through the process every single time. This being said, I still do it because I'm a little bit picky about security, but first and foremost, it's it kind of forces me to think about which privileges do I want to use. I noticed that previously when I didn't use privileged identity management, I'd sometimes log in as a global admin and not actually use those permissions. So it's kind of enforcing me to go with the least privileged model, which from a security operations perspective is just a better way. But more importantly, each time I log on, I activate my permissions, it requires me to add a little wording on why did I need it in the first place, right? It gives me an audit trail, which coincidentally, I actually look at once or twice a month, not for myself, but I've got colleagues of mine that activate their roles, and I just go over them and be like, why did they do this? Like, why did they give this reason? Or if they didn't specify a reason, I'm like, well, hey, you didn't specify a reason on why you needed that role, right? It's kind of peer pressure, if you will, but it's not so much the fact that it's peer pressure, it's the fact that there's a trail that people have to go through the process, that you have to make them think about the permissions they need, which makes that system, inherently interesting. Conditional access. I'm not going to talk too much about that. Basically, if this, then that on steroids for corporate authentication policies. You can determine what conditions are required in order to access an application. And by application, I mean any application that authenticates through conditional access, you can throw in the conditional access policies. So you have a very flexible set in determining what can be done and how you can connect to certain things. One of my biggest my biggest regrets so far with conditional access is that it wasn't able, or that it isn't able, to actually protect individual SharePoint sites. Guess what? There is a public preview that allows you to determine which website should either require MFA or have other conditions, or you could block access on a specific website based on conditions. It's a much asked feature, and of course, conditional access is widely used everywhere, but it's underutilized in my opinion, because you can do so many fun stuff with it. Anyway, move on. Office ATP, right? Office ATP, basically, I, in good conscience, would never go to a customer and tell them, let's start using Office 365 without having ATP. The Exchange Online Protection, EOP, for message hygiene is good. It's not great. ATP goes from good to great. It adds that level of protection which you actually need to be safe from modern attacks. Whereas the anti-phishing capability or the safe links capability, those things are crucial because phishing and malicious links and malicious attacks or malicious attachments are still the #1 way on how people get into your environment. So it's absolutely a must to have that enabled in my book, right? Let's move on to Azure ATP, or the next version after Azure ATA, or no, sorry, not the ATA. The ATA on premises, then the cloud component called Azure ATP. Let's call it identity protection for on-premises, right? Advanced threat protection, looking at your on-premises Active Directory, trying to detect anomalous behavior activities, and then surface that right in the dashboard in the tenant. Pass the hash, overpass the hash, golden ticket attacks, Kerber roasting, everything that we're talking about, all these types of attacks that are very popular, and which, by the way, are one of the most, or not one of them, which are the most commonly used types of gaining access to an environment. It will detect and surface up there. And maybe I'm running a little bit ahead of certain things, but this is so crucial, important, because Azure ATP, I mean, looking at a hybrid deployment, and by hybrid deployment, I don't mean exchange hybrid or anything of that sort, but most organizations I work with, they're not full cloud. Like, they've got legacy, they've got an Active Directory environment, and everyone's worried about, ooh, cloud security, this, cloud security, that, and I agree, right? Cloud security is important, but what is even more important is securing a legacy, because most of the attacks happen through a legacy on-premise, through that legacy system. And through gaining access in that legacy environment, they can actually compromise the cloud. Very little compromises happen or are born in the cloud. Maybe they come in through an email in the cloud, but they'll try and attack the on-premises environment, get a foothold that way, maybe establish domain dominance, and then from there on, everything's fair game to them, right? So Azure ATP is, to me, a really critical component. BitLocker, it's kind of the same, right? I can't even remember how long drive encryption has been around, like for so long. Yet there's still organizations that do not enable BitLocker by default. Granted, at home, I've got the same problem, and I only recently realized how much of a problem, well, not problem it is, but how stupid that is. But first of all, right, enabling BitLocker, super easy, like really easy. What does it add? Well, functionally, it doesn't add anything to you. You won't notice it's there. It doesn't take away any performance, really. Maybe in the olden days it did, but with newer hardware these days, you don't even notice there is encryption running. And for a fixed computer, which is maybe tied to your desk, like my machine here, which is about 250 kilos, chances are very slim that someone will get into my house, get past me, get to my computer, take my disk, and actually read something from my disk. Right? That's one of the things. But in the mobile world, having mobile encryption, making sure that your data is safe when the device is stolen or lost, it doesn't even have to be malicious. But how often do you get to hear, well, I found this and I tried to open it and it was there, or where, hey, I'll give you another example where BitLocker is useful. Talking to a customer, they said, yeah, you know what we do? We have our computers, and once we're done, we throw them away. There's people going to these collection centers. They take away these computers to refurbish them, and the first thing they do is, there's a hard drive in there. Let's see what we can get off of these hard drives. One could argue that is illegal, which in some cases it may be, but I think it's just plain stupid that you took your hard drive, left it in the computer, and put it elsewhere. It's great that you've gotten certain faith in people, but just having BitLocker on there would help against certain of these scenarios, provided you didn't first wipe the device. And by wiping the device, I mean multiple times to make sure the data is unavailable. Either way, BitLocker, you just have to do that, right? Hello for Business, another capability. It's not so much the fact that I can wave and smile at my computer and it unlocks that makes it great. It does from an end user perspective, but Hello for Business is mainly interesting because of what's happening underneath, right? The passwordless authentication bits and pieces, which therefore increases security. And as such, I'm a huge fan of using Hello for Business. Maybe a little bit outside of the realm of Microsoft 365, sits Azure Security Center. I look at Azure Security Center and see that as the police of Azure, right? Keeping track of the security posture of everything that you've deployed in Azure, making sure that you can get recommendations. So there's a bit of threat and vulnerability management in there. There's a little bit of Defender ATP actually in there, right? Because it can be orchestrated or deployed through Azure Security Center on all the VMs running in Azure. So to me, it's kind of like the Office ATP, right? Which is a crucial and really important component of any deployment or anything that you do in Azure. And why is that so important? And what is the relation with M365? Well, it's components that live in Azure, but that you use in your workplace. WVD, for instance, Windows Virtual Desktop. To me, I mean, I didn't put it on the slide. I could have put it in there because it's core part of, it could be core part of the workplace, and it is a really valid solution. But you have to maintain, or you have to look at the infrastructure. You have to look at the virtual machines, making sure that everything is up and running. You have to maintain the security on that one as well. This is where the Azure Security Center actually comes in on top of the other controls that you may have in place, like Defender ATP, engine enrollment, and so forth and so on. Same is true for Azure Sentinel, right? All the other stuff that we're talking about generate log files. They have to go somewhere, right? Now, each of these products, like Cloud App Security, Identity Protection, Defender ATP, have their own portals, have their own log files. And you can independently go at them and follow up and look at them, and that's great. That's all right. But it's not very practical, nor are you doing anything on top of that. Now, threat protection is the M365 native capability of doing a little bit more with the log files. But if you want to go beyond M365, if you want to ingest Azure data, AWS data, on-premises firewalls, proxy servers, other applications, then this is where Azure Sentinel as a SIEM and SOAR solution actually comes into play and can help you gain visibility in what's happening in your environment, write custom detection rules based on KQL to raise alerts on specific things. It's this. Next week, Michael is going to talk about the Swiss Army knife of deployment, I believe. Well, Azure Sentinel is the Swiss Army knife of security in terms of alerting and responding to those events and alerts in your environment.
Michael, can I interrupt you? We have a question from one of the attendees.
Sure.
It's from John, and he asks, do you see many implementations of Windows Hello for Business with on-premises AD?
John, keep that thought. I'm going to rush through the other items, and then I'm going to switch a button, and then I'm going to talk about whether or not I see that a lot. Is that a good answer?
Sounds good.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll keep that in mind. Hello for Business. Do I see it a lot with on-prem? So AIP labeling, great, right? It's a compliance feature, kind of increases security, data security, super useful. But the problem is not technology. Well, it is. But the problem is people. In order for AIP, or labeling, or sensitivity labeling, or whatever, unified labeling, the name that marketing just gave it last week, is only valid if you do it consistently, either automatically on each file, because if you want to go into the realm of data security, you have to classify data and you have to do that vigorously. If you're just going to do it once in a while, just don't do it, right? That's lost effort, right? But AIP can be really useful, not just from an encryption perspective, because to me, the concept of AIP is much more than just than encryption. It can help because it can make sure that only specific people can read and consume data. But the fact that it's labeled, that you actually know what kind of data that you're working with, enables other solutions like Cloud App Security, like Windows Information Protection, like DLP, to actually reason over the data and do something smart with it. Block outbound traffic, block copying the file, preventing someone else from doing stuff with it. So the notion of classification is more important than the fact that it can actually enforce permissions on a file, at least in my book. Endpoint Manager, threw it in there into an SCCM. I mean, it's kind of the premise for everything. Well, let me go back. It's not the premise of everything, but in order to, maintain Defender ATP policies, right? you have to have a way of controlling the device, of pushing the policies. Well, this is where Endpoint Manager comes in. Same is true for some of the other applications or features. BitLocker, hey, Endpoint Manager can help you, right? You want to push specific labels or specific applications? Let's use Endpoint Manager, SCCM, or Intune. There's so many things that you can need to do through these management platforms that it almost becomes the prerequisite for a lot of the underlying stuff specific to the device and operating system, right? Identity governance, right? We're jumping all over the place, but it's on purpose. Identity governance, basically lifecycle management for your identity. Being able to maintain your identity is equally important than securing it on the authentication bits and pieces. I've seen way too many cases where someone leaves the organization and 6 months after that, they still have access to data because someone forgot to disable an account, or they forgot to disable an account everywhere, right? Some organizations have a really complex environment with multiple accounts, multiple environments. So first of all, SSO helps. I'm going to talk about that because it's only one account to maintain. But if you can't, then identity governance can help, reason over who has access where and what groups they are, and forces you to, think about these things on a regular basis. That's where it can be really useful for, right? The access reviews, which is part of it, but also streamlining the process around how you deal with identities. That's what I see as the true added value for identity governance. I'm going to single out a Windows 10 feature, AppLocker, the ability to restrict which applications can run on a device. That just sounds like the panacea. Hey, I'm just going to use a Windows 10 device. I'm going to tell it which applications can run on that device, and then I'm done. No more malicious software can run. No more executables that I don't want can run. Life's great. Keep that in mind when I'm going to talk about some of the limitations and some of the reasons why AppLocker sounds better than it really is. SSO for applications, or SSO in general. Again, it's a functional something, right? It's something I experience as a user. Only have to type in my password once, but under the hood, it solves a lot of other problems. One identity means, one thing I can mess up as a user, right? And that's really important because users can mess up a lot of things if you leave them to it. I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a very loving way. But having SSO improves their experience, improves security, simplifies lifecycle management, so there's really no reason why you shouldn't pursue SSO for apps. Under the hood, it actually means that you have to take all these applications and connect them to that same identity system. Basically, how we used to do it for Active Directory on premises, right? A lot of organizations these days still have a written policy that says whenever a new application is installed in our environment, it needs to connect to Active Directory. Well, I'm trying to change the minds of my customers and tell them, well, no, that's not true. Whenever you buy or you create a new application, it has to integrate with Azure AD, period. Let's get away from that previous AD story, but more importantly, create such a policy that forces everyone that buys a new application to actually think of it. I'll give you one example, right? We were debating a little while ago the use of a password manager. And we had a couple of solutions that were available, and ultimately, we went for the only application that was able to integrate with Azure AD, because that allowed me to keep one identity to control who has access to the password vault. And I know that when I disable the account, that person loses the ability to open the password vault, which may have access, may have credentials to customers' environments, right? Which is crucially important to me. That by itself, even though there were some other quirks in the use of that password vault, made me decide to go for that. A lot more organizations should start doing that to simplify their landscape and just force that SSO experience. Then there's XGuard, Credential Guard, Exploit Guard, all the guard capabilities in Windows 10. Very useful for a variety of stuff, right? Preventing malware attacks, preventing malicious activity, and so forth and so on. I truly believe, because depending on how you look at it, it's a Windows 10 feature, it's part of their next-gen protection of Defender ATP. There's a lot of good stuff in there which can really up the security of your device. Obviously, kind of tailored to Windows 10 more specifically, but it's still a very, very important capability. DLP kind of is in the same bucket as AIP. I think it's really useful for two reasons. It can be useful if you've got structured data, But if you've got unstructured data, yeah, the data loss prevention is tough. But if you combine both, like if you classify unstructured data while you're creating the data, then you can use the fact that it was classified in a DLP rule to prevent leaking the data or losing the data. And it kind of reinforces itself, right? So those integrations become really important. But again, that's DLP. Office message encryption, I'm almost nearly there, all right? Office message encryption, basically combination of secure email, well, it's secure email that encrypts messages on the way out to your customers or to your recipients, and then either just encrypts them and allows them to read that in unencrypted form, or it can even instill specific permissions or use rights on the email. Like I can prevent someone from forwarding the email and so forth and so on. Again, very useful, but between you and I, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of user experience. And it's not so much Microsoft that needs to solve the problem. It's just a concept of message encryption and the diversity of the landscape, right? There's Google, there's Exchange Online, there's Zimber, there's people still using that. There's so many, there's Yahoo, there's this, there's that. There's so many different email systems worldwide that the experience really depends on who receives the message. And I truly believe that we should go more for an interchangeable experience, more integration on the back end. But obviously, with so many cooks in the kitchen, that's really hard. Again, that's OME. And then the layer 2 ones, customer key, customer logbox. Again, it's not really security features. It's more from a compliance perspective. Basically, having more control about how the data is stored within the Microsoft data centers, or how Microsoft can access the data. So in customer key, what you're doing is, before data is being written to disk in Office 365, Exchange Online, SharePoint, Teams, and so forth and so on, basically it's being, it is today already encrypted with storage keys from Microsoft. You're just, adding another layer of encryption on top of that based on your own keys, which you can then store in an Azure Key Vault, and then you can revoke at any given time. Once you revoke those keys, the data becomes gibberish, right? The service can't read it anymore because it doesn't have access to the keys anymore. Customer keys, literally a check mark. It doesn't bring any additional value in terms of functionality, nor does it take away any functionality, but it's a rather important one if you are working with highly sensitive data, secured environments, mostly government environments, in my opinion. Customer logbox is kind of tied to that, but not in the same way. Basically, it's privileged identity management for Microsoft. There you go. Whenever an engineer needs to get access to your tenant to troubleshoot something, they already have to go through an internal approval process, right? It's not that people at Microsoft have standing permissions to Office 365, but at some point, sometimes they have to investigate stuff, and they can go through an internal process and then get access to your tenant in order to review things. Adding customer logbox just adds another step in the process that requires the customer, being you, to approve the request to actually gain access, so that you're always aware when an engineer is gaining access to your tenant, and you need to approve it before it does. Again, to me, it's more a jackbox that that marks a compliance capability somewhere, or appeases certain people's minds. But functionally, I don't see the biggest value there, but I understand why it is required and why in certain scenarios that is absolutely needed. So with this in mind, right, we've just talked in incredible speed about all of these capabilities, and there's a lot more to be said about these things. But what do I see being used? Well, identity protection, conditional access, Office ATP, a lot of Defender ATP lately, BitLocker and Endpoint Manager, in a lot of places. The BitLocker one, I've kind of doubted for a little bit of time. What should I do with this? Is it green? Like, is everyone using it? But all in all, just looking at the data I have with all my customers, I can say that a lot of them are actually using BitLocker, which is great. Not all of them, but a lot of them. I'm getting to the lost ones. So I'm using that a little bit as a gauge on how the market is doing. Now, the Defender ATP part, I'm biased, right? I do this a lot. Like I help a lot of customers deploy Defender ATP just because it's great. So I put it green just because I want it to be green. To be honest, I'm afraid, and it's kind of misleading. It should have been orange or red, but it's not just Defender ATP. There's way too many organizations out here still running on an antivirus, not even EDR. Just a basic antivirus. That scares me. That really scares me. Looking at the attack techniques someone has or an attacker has, the breadth of capabilities they have to enter a system, then you just understand and know that a regular antivirus no longer makes the cut. So there is no reason why you should not be investing in an EDR solution. And then obviously, you know, within the Microsoft stack, it makes a lot of sense to start using Defender ATP because of its integrations with Cloud App Security, because the capabilities that it has of feeding that information, but also from the performance capabilities, right? Looking at the reports from last year, it's consistently scoring top notch, right? And that's Defender ATP on top of Defender AV. So they kind of go hand in hand, and it's like the perfect marriage between the two things. They consistently score really, really well on different independent tests, but more importantly, because these independent tests focus on file malware. But recently, like a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, the Mitra framework was used, or the Mitra Corporation actually tested the effectiveness of EDR solutions against known vulnerabilities being exploited by an attack group called APT29. And they've tested a lot of solutions, and they've published the results of that test online. And guess what? Defender ATP came out on top in terms of detections, speed of detection, what they detected, how they detected it. It wasn't 100%. None of the solutions had 100%, but it was really good in terms of visibility and how you could detect and stop these new actively exploited threats or actively used attack techniques in the wild. You would never be able to do that with just a simple AV. Anyway, let's take a look at what's in red, right? Red is things I believe I don't see nearly as much as I'd like them to see. I spoke about Windows information protection, right? I love it to death. I don't have a single customer that is actually actively pursuing this. It drives me mad in terms of how much I love it, and I get why, right? But still, it's something very useful. But there is a reason why some of these are in red, just because you need to do other stuff first before that makes sense. It doesn't make sense to instill Windows information protection if you have not enrolled entirely into Endpoint Manager, obviously. There's other priorities you have, and that's normal, right? You have to create that threat matrix. I've given a lot of talks about find your why. Why should you deploy any of this? Well, you make a risk matrix. You do a risk assessment. Based on the risk assessment, you determine which ones are your top priorities, and then you go fix those. And once you fix those, you go to the next ones, and the next ones, and so forth and so on. So I get why Windows information protection isn't the top one, because it focuses, along with AIP and even DLP, it focuses more on data protection than physical protection of the device, or cybersecurity protection on the device itself. So as such, that really explains some of the red ones. Customer key and lockbox, it's not because it's not great features, it's just, as I said, check mark, you have to pay for it. So a lot of organizations, look at it and be like, well, I'm not, I don't see the value. I'm not going to pay X amount of euros a month extra just to be able to, add that layer of encryption, or, have an engineer, request access to the tenant, which is obviously why you don't see them as much. Identity governance and privileged identity management, it pains me. It pains me to see so little environments take advantage of these capabilities. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, Michael, but those are Azure AD Premium P2 licenses. Those are expensive. Sure, but what's more expensive, right? Being hacked, you're having a breach, I mean, you know, I'm not the one to throw out buzzwords like GDPR out there, but I am. But you know, there's going to be a time where if you have a breach and data is lost or leaked, it's going to cost you a massive amount of money, right? Spending a little bit of money to protect you from certain things, it's not a bad thing per se, right? I get it, right? Not everyone is able to carve it out right now, and these are challenging times. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have any value by itself. Identities, protected, we're good at protecting them. Well, no, actually we aren't. MFA should have been on the slide, right? There's still too many people not using MFA. Partially because I believe that Microsoft could do a much better job at the user experience. Like the notifications you get on your phone, please describe to me where they're coming from, what triggered them, and not just something's trying to authenticate. Do you want to approve or do you not want to approve? You kind of get the gist, right? It works both ways, and I believe that's one of the reasons why people don't want to do that, the click fatigue. I mean, we do this test as part of some of the audits we do for customers. I sometimes just tell them, can I, you know, try and invoke a session of one of these users, right? And then I would do that. They would get a, you know, they would get a notification, and then within a meeting, sometimes you would see people look at the screen and be like, "Yep, they've been paying attention to a presentation. They got a notification that someone is trying to access their account. It wasn't them, and they still clicked yes." That's user education, but it's a problem we created ourselves by having way too many pop-ups and notifications and so forth and so on. So there's a little bit of work to be done, but it's crucially important that you do that first before you start investing time and money into privileged identity management and identity governance, right? Because those are back-end processes. Notwithstanding, they are crucially important. Azure ATP kind of follows the same line. Why is it not used as much? Why am I not seeing it being adopted more broadly? Well, it's just because a lot of people look at the cloud and forget about the legacy, right? But the legacy is, as I mentioned earlier, where the problems lie. Either get rid of on-prem legacy, which I'm all for, or adequately protect it. And Azure ATP can really help in that regard. And then there is everything else, which I see is orange. What does orange mean? I see it being used. I see it become more popular. So, you know, the Defender ATP should have been orange. But I don't see it as much, or I see it for the wrong reasons, or there was something off with it. Like Microsoft Threat Protection, you know, the other day, honestly, I'm not kidding you, I'm not making this up. New customer, M365 E5, right? What more do you want to have? Like full M365 E5. Had to explain that security.microsoft.com was a thing and what you could do with it. I think MTP is falling a prey of the marketing shenanigans at Microsoft because they are great at confusing everyone. And you've got the Security and Compliance Center, you've got the Admin Center, then you've got the Azure Portal, and you've got the Windows Security Center, and then now you've got the Compliance Center and the Security Center. You know, which one to use, where, why, how, just makes it very confusing. Honestly, these people had access to it. They could use it. They just were not aware because it was too confusing. And at the end of the day, they had like 8 portals and they really didn't know which one to pick. I think that's a technology problem that needs solving, and Microsoft's working on that, right? They're combining stuff in there, and the messaging is getting more consistent and better. But you know, once you have the licenses for it, I'd love to see a little bit more usage. You know, in my experience, to see that from going from orange to green. And John, I didn't forget about you. Hello for Business. I'm going to talk about it in just a minute. Cloud App Security, it's kind of the same thing. The ones that have licenses for it are actively using it. A lot of people that don't have the licenses for it yet, or you know, have not gotten to deploying it, or have deployed it but in a very limited way. The first thing that a lot of organizations do is use it for visibility, which I wholeheartedly agree with. Like, enable Microsoft Defender with a Cloud App Security or ingest log files so that you know what you're dealing with. What's the size of your shadow IT in your environment? Which I believe is, you know, really important. Know before you go, get visibility, and then you know what you should focus on. Yet I see a lot of organizations that just stay in the, yeah, we're monitoring from a distance kind of perspective. it's, great to have all that intelligence, but it's even better if you can actually put them to work, right? Use conditional access app policies, right, in order to force that connection through cloud app security and do things more intelligently, right? Maybe integrate information protection labeling with cloud app security so that you actually get to a better data security perspective. But again, there's no sense in enabling that feature if you don't do labeling, but there's no sense in enabling labeling if you're not going to follow up. So there's a certain order of things that you have to go through, that you have to navigate through in order to get to the panacea where, ideally everything is green. Let's talk about Hello for Business, right? I see used a lot individually, where there's a new Surface device, especially on the Windows devices, right? Hey, I've enabled Hello for Business. I see it being used a lot in cloud native deployments, where cloud native or almost cloud only, or cloud first deployments, where the primary authentication of the device is used on the device itself, on Azure AD, right? So my device is Azure AD joined and not per se hybrid Azure AD joined. The full Hello for Business experience, where it's hybrid connected with on-premises Active Directory, honestly, this almost nothing, right? Understandable, because there is a certain complexity that goes with it, which kind of keeps people in the back in terms of should we deploy it, should we not deploy it. It's the chicken or the egg problem, right? Underneath, it's not so much Hello for Business as a feature or as a technology, it's the fact that it's passwordless authentication. And when you take a look at what's the blocking factor, it's not the shiny cloud that you're looking at, it's the on-prem legacy that has issues with it. And the few deployments that I've seen that have worked with Hello for Business, the full hybrid model that is, have either stranded or are struggling with the fact that you authenticate with Hello for Business, but that applications can't leverage it, and you still need to authenticate, which kind of messes up the user experience. And therefore, it's not very great. I mean, in our organization, we enforce Hello for Business. Yes, you have to use a biometric, right, in order to authenticate, because we believe it's the right thing to do. But it's easy. Small company, no on-prem legacy stuff, everything Azure AD SSO integrated. Ha! Yes, of course. Then that would be green. But we're far from a situation where this is mainstream in the hybrid deployments and so forth and so on. Also because in the journey to passwordless, which is becoming more and more important, it will grow, I'm sure of it, in terms of adoption and actually usage. But I think there's still a tiny bit of complexity too much, and there's still a lot of legacy left to deal with that is not entirely covered by this. But again, you can more easily do that if you have more SSO Azure AD integrated applications, so that at some point, just get rid of Active Directory. Right? Which kind of brings me to the point, why do we still use on-premises Active Directory? Just why? Why, or let's just say that you have file servers and so forth and so on, which I get, fine. Why join your computers to Azure, to on-premises Active Directory? Why not just join them to Azure AD and have primary authentication there? As long as you synchronize your devices from on-prem to the cloud, right? As long as you synchronize them and make sure that the data is there and the connectivity is there, you can have an Azure AD joint device do single sign-on to an on-premises file server or any other server that needs user-based authentication. Authentication in device context, which actually not used that much, is the only thing that doesn't work. But under the user context, that works. So what I'm doing now, right, instead of focusing on getting Hello for Business and hybrid stuff ready, I'm just trying to force people to go to cloud only. Well, not cloud only. They can keep AD for now because the legacy stuff you can move really quickly. But just get your devices in there. Just go cloud native with the devices. You still have SSO on premises, but it solves a lot of other problems, right? And through Endpoint Manager into an SCCM or into just by itself, you can have the security posture that you need. You don't need GPOs to keep a secure Windows device. You can just do that through different policies, and you have a great experience. This is, in my opinion, one of these things that can be an enabler to have more of these buckets or these buttons green. Azure Sentinel, why do I put it in orange? Well, it's fairly new, right? I'm biased. Almost all customers I work with, we go in, we enable Azure Sentinel just because we love it and we use it for our managed services. So yeah, sure, of course it's green. But in reality, looking around, talking to people, listening to people, either there's a lot of organizations that don't have a SIEM, more and more are thinking about implementing one or are in the process of implementing one, or there's a lot of legacy SIEMs that are being used elsewhere, and that's great, right? There's a lot of Splunk out there. There's QRadar, Logarithm, and so forth and so on. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem of SIEM solutions, of which Azure Sentinel is a new kid on the block. Considering the time it's existed, I think the adoption is actually really good, but it's not nowhere near the green parts that I'd like to see. Same for Azure Security Center. Way too many customers have Azure but don't use the Azure Security Center. Well, they've got the free version, but they're not paying for the additional security layer. It's not because it's running in the cloud that you don't have to secure it. It's not because it's running in the cloud that you have to overly secure it. You have to just adequately secure that. And this is one of the things, one of the underrated values of Defender ATP Cloud App Security in the Azure Security Center. It's the ability to follow up or to measure your security posture. So it's the cloud security posture management capabilities to follow up on the configuration, to make sure you didn't make any mistakes, to kind of gamify the score you get, to make sure that you maintain a consistent pace to a more secure configuration. That is really important, and that drives a lot of value, in my opinion, because these cloud native systems understand the cloud. They know which configuration parameters are really important, and they can bring that to your visibility. Basically, it's a smart to-do list. If you go into Defender ATP threat and vulnerability management, it's a smart to-do list. It says, here's vulnerable software. Well, take that list, do something about it. That was my to-do list for today. Cloud App Security can do the same thing, tell you, hey, these are the insecure configurations, go and fix them. Same for Azure Security Center and so forth and so on. And then lastly, the bottom line, SSO for applications, mentioned it earlier. We should do that more and more. I'm not going to beat that one to death. I think I've done that enough. But you should really establish a policy that says, this is our identity provider. This is the authentication process. Everything from here on integrates with that so that you can get that experience and drive other stuff as well. And then in terms of credential guard, exploit guard, it kind of gets together with Defender ATP. To me, that's an incremental increase, right? You start by an antivirus, you add an EDR, you add attack surface reduction, you add web protection, you add exploit guard, you add this, you add that, and so forth and so on. And then entirely at the end, you're free to roam and try and use AppLocker. The problem is with AppLocker, it's a whitelisting problem, right? You have to whitelist application that can run on a system. And this is absolutely crucially important if you want to build a secure access workstation, right? A privileged access workstation, whatever you want to call it these days, in order to make sure that only specific software can run. But if you want to do that on a regular workstation where software is running, but people can install and remove software, basically, if you want to do that in a living environment where there's new executables coming in and out, legitimate use of new executables and coming in and out, AppLocker is not super friendly. Same for DLP. I mean, most organizations have some DLP rules, like your credit card numbers, we can't share them, and so forth and so on. And these are the examples that you see everywhere. But a lot of customers I work with, they don't deal with credit card numbers. They don't deal with social security numbers. They deal with other types of data that isn't necessarily, structured, that isn't necessarily fitting one of these rules. And this is where DLP in general is lacking behind. It can fix it if you do classification, but then classification in itself requires a mind shift, requires you to actually classify either automated or manually, but also means that you have to think about, what's the data that you're working with. And a lot of organizations are not at the stage where they're capable of comprehending all of that. To be honest, looking at all the orange and the red stuff on screen, I think there's a lot of other things that they should be focusing on first. and then tackle this. But the whole classification, data security, data-driven security is crucial. Not just when you're managing devices, but also in a cloud world when there's a lot of BYOD. And in my opinion, this is something that a lot of organizations will start using in a much more intelligent, or should start using in a much more intelligent way over the next couple of years. And then Office and advanced message encryption, as I mentioned before, great, low key, because it's just clicking a button. In order to enable it, it's enabled by default. It's just the end user experience on the receiving end that isn't great, which hampers the technology. I mean, to give you an example, Microsoft, I'm really sorry, but I'm just going to use it. Almost every time I send an encrypted message to someone at Microsoft, I get a reply back, couldn't open it. Can you send it without encryption? And it's not just them, it's everywhere. And it's not just Office message encryption. There is other solutions out there, which I've tested, doing the same thing. I send it to someone and they respond like, oh, the trouble I have to go through, like, why are you doing this to me? I couldn't open it, it's not working, I can't see it, I can't forward it, I can do this. It's just, the way that it works today is, for a lot of organizations, not fitting what they need to do. I sometimes see organizations use Office message encryption for end-to-end encryption. And when you mean end-to-end, from where it leaves the device, basically, or the service, and gets to the recipient, then yes, it is end-to-end. But you could force a TLS tunnel between those two systems and have nearly end-to-end and have good protection as well without impacting the user experience. So there's a lot of things to consider before broadly using Office message encryption. I mean, I had one customer once that told me, all outgoing messages, they are sensitive by nature, I want to use Office message encryption. I applaud the idea that they wanted to do something or to secure that data, but that's not the right solution. Like sending out mass Office message encryption messages, honestly, not a great idea. I urge you to do it to test something. Take an Office message encryption, right? Or take a message, encrypt it using Office message encryption, and send it to a distribution list. Have fun, right? These are things that need to be solved before the experience becomes better and it becomes a much more viable solution in much more situations. Doesn't mean that it's not viable in specific use cases. Like if I want to securely share something with a colleague or with an external recipient, I will mandate the use of Office message encryption for myself, and I will use it because I shall not send a password via email, right? And nor shall I do that via WhatsApp or whatever, right? These are things specific items that you want to be absolutely sure about where it can really be useful. But until some of the underlying problems are solved, it'll remain orange to me. But there's definitely a trend to a lot of these capabilities. So this being said, I've been talking for nearly an hour now. I'm not sure if there's any other questions, but this is where I want to wrap up things, maybe open up the floor for some more questions.
Yeah, we have some questions lying around for you.
Sure.
So the first one is from Pascal. And Pascal asks, in regard to Windows information protections, what are your thoughts on unenlightened apps and managing these types of apps? And are you thinking about monitoring, analytics? The information can be found in the event viewer, but isn't there a dashboard for this? Like, for example, Power BI.
Yep. So absolutely lovely, right? You highlighted a problem with Windows information protection, right? Usability, not usability, sorry, it's very usable. Configuration. It's kind of like you have to build a list of enlightened applications that are allowed to consume data, or build a list of not enlightened applications which cannot use that data, and then you've got everything in the middle, and you can exempt applications which should be able to use that data but don't natively support that. I mean, there's a whole set of race conditions which make the setup of Windows information protection sometimes a little bit more challenging. To be fair, right, the setup of Windows information protection on my device, before I found the right configuration, it took me a while, right? Obviously, I started with the recommendation from Microsoft of exempting, well, not exempting, of enlightening all the Office applications, and then exempting a few other applications. But then I quickly found out that there was Adobe, there was Acrobat DC, and there was that version, and that I'm all running on my device. And it was a great exercise because it forced me to remove some of the junk that I had on my devices. But it clearly highlighted that, you have to think about this, right? It's not something that you deploy in a day's time. Setting up the policy is one day's work. It's figuring out which application should be using this and that. Now, take a look at your environment, right? Take a look at some of your customers. The majority of them are actually almost using all the same applications, right? Office, which is number one. Everyone's using Office. They're using Adobe. They're using a bunch of applications. And you will find that a lot of these Windows information protection policies can be distilled down to a number of applications. And then you've got the variations on a per customer basis. So there's that in terms of deployment. And you will run into here's a policy and you'll get feedback like, this stopped working. You're like, forgot about that application, right? In terms of logging, yes, there is information going into the Windows event log. So if you're using Azure Sentinel and you see where all these things are coming together, you can actually take the event logs, get them in Azure Sentinel, build a dashboard on top of the underlying log analytics workspace, get the data that you want, build an alert rule if you want, and do fancy stuff with it, right? You can have the logic apps reason over the data, or you can have an alert being thrown by Sentinel, have a logic app kickoff, do something with it. That gives you the manageability of what you're searching for behind that capability. So once the data from the device is up in usable storage, which in this case is log analytics, you can have Sentinel do stuff with it. You can have other programs do stuff with it. Azure Monitor, you can build your own dashboards. Basically, the sky is the limit.
Great. Hey, the next question is from Michel. Michel asks if a customer still uses ADFS. He's experiencing issues sometimes with Azure AD joins, password changing from the Windows login screen as example. What's your advice on these situations?
So I'm biased, right? I hate ADFS. Honestly, I loved ADFS back in the days. I hate it these days. For a variety of reasons. I mean, there is a good place for ADFS in the world, right? Federation, it's used in a lot of situations, but ask yourself, why are you using it in the first place? Like, why is it there? I have so many customers that have got 2 ADFS servers, 2 ADFS proxies, because that's recommended, and they only use it for Office 365. Why would you do that? There's no reason to keep that around. Single sign-on, well, use PTA, use SSO. We've got alternatives right now that can replace this. And even from that perspective, if you've got an ADFS farm that's used for Office 365, but also for Salesforce, other applications, great. Keep it for those other applications while you're working to get them natively into Azure AD. And just move your Office 365 authentication. Use password hash synchronization. Use PHS with SSO. That's my favorite. Like, honestly, PHS and SSO, if you've got on-premise joined devices, and all your hybrid Azure AD joined problems, they go away. They just go away. And the problem with ADFS is not so much ADFS, because ADFS in itself isn't bad. It's just that a lot of organizations are really horrible at maintaining and working with it, and the additional complexity. Not a lot of people really fully grasp ADFS. Plus, it's your responsibility, right? It's one more thing on your list that you have to maintain that you're responsible for. At the end of the day, if you move away that authentication to the cloud, that piece of software cannot influence your user's experience anymore. It cannot break some of the hybrid join scenarios anymore. It cannot prevent people from logging in if there is a denial of service attack. It cannot be used anymore to gain access to your Office 365 environment. Therefore, it's one less liability. So if you want to have my opinion, do away with ADFS and move to something else like cloud native authentication. And it's doable, because recently, not that long ago, helped a customer, about 8,000 seats, to move from ADFS through stage authentication, right, where you can move people, groups of people, and from ADFS to cloud native authentication, bit by bit, until everyone's moved over, and then you just decommission ADFS and you're done, right? That's a really good experience, and that really helps in complex and large environments. Sorry.
Okay, great, thanks. Hey, the next question is from Usama. Usama has a quite a large question, so give me a minute to rephrase. Usama asks, hello, I'm struggling to find an option to protect that on customer devices. I want to have the option to allow access to data from corporate devices, and every non-corporate device should only have limited online access. All the tools we have now sometimes can't cut it. Any ideas how to fix this?
Yeah. Go ahead. Did you have anything else to add, Kenneth? Or?
Yeah, he further adds, I asked this question because compliance status in Intune is really buggy sometimes, and I want to make policies based on ownership, not compliance status, as that will make bring your own device scenarios much easier.
Yep. Hey, that's a really good question. I agree. I mean, reporting of compliance states or just reporting in general in Intune needs an overhaul. Like, I love Intune and the capabilities, but gosh, updating statuses and everything else, it just takes forever, right? And it's buggy. I agree. Like, sometimes I would just, eat my hat. So I agree, right? So how do you solve this problem? Well, there's multiple ways of looking at it. Data-centric security is one of them. Remember what I said earlier, that your organizations will have to focus on the data rather than everything around that? Well, we've been saying this for a lot of time, but now we're slowly getting to a point where technology is catching up with that paradigm and will allow you to do stuff like that. Now, if you want to segregate access based on the type of data that you're trying to access, then there's one thing: categorize data. How are you going to keep people from accessing specific data here and there if you do not classify the data? Are you going to do it because it's stored in file share A and file share B? Okay, that is one way, so that you're doing system-based segregation. But what if I take one file and put it in the other one? I just punched a hole in your security strategy. So realistically speaking, what you need to do is kind of make sure that you identify the data. That is step one, right? Then there is step two, right? I think that Microsoft is going the right way with enabling conditional access and a per site collection basis, right? Where conditional access allows you to access a site collection in the back based on a specific set of criteria, not necessarily conditional access speed, but think a little bit further. What if at some point in the future, Microsoft would get the brilliant idea, and maybe I should make a user voice item out of this, that we should have a conditional access policy based on the data that you're trying, or the site classification that you're trying to open. Actually, we can do that today. If you use conditional access app control, you can actually create an inline session policy that looks at the data that you're trying to download. And if the data is classified as sensitive, it can either prevent the download or force the use of corporate device through the compliance state, or force AFS, or not AFS, force MFA, or have other things happen. So if you classify the data, if you identify the data, you can leverage Cloud Security's capabilities to actually do that. Now, honestly, it requires a huge amount of effort, and then obviously the question comes, but what with data that I cannot classify, i.e. non-native files, non-native Office files, or what should I do with data that I can't classify natively is a better question. There is no good technological answer or there's no system that will solve your problems like this today, right? There is a hybrid approach, right? You have to have managed devices in order to set these secure devices apart from BYOD devices. And yes, unfortunately today, your compliance state is the only way of doing that, right? Of assessing that. And for better and worse, yes, it's buggy sometimes, but it works, right? So that's one thing. And secondly, you have to categorize your data. You have to make sure that you know what data you're working with. Thirdly, you need cloud security in order to enforce that session restriction if you're coming into the environment from a non-corporate device, BYOD device, therefore in a non-compliant state. So that these are all the components that you need to have in place before you can actually get to that point. And I was actually going to make another point there. Obviously, you have to monitor and maintain to make sure that there are specific situations that the legitimate exceptions, because they always exist. And then for applications that you cannot go, not applications, for systems or data that you cannot classify, you have to have an alternative, i.e. people with a BYOD device that, don't have a corporate device should still be able to access the data without being able to exfiltrate the data. And this is where, for instance, Windows Virtual Desktop really comes in greatly. You don't have to invest in an infrastructure to provide that virtual desktop capability to someone. You just tell them, oh, these two applications, great. There's the virtual desktop, log in through the desktop, use whatever your device you want, because you can't copy it from outside the Windows Virtual Desktop to that other device, and they can work on a Windows device with the data, and it is secured because you maintain it and support it and so on. That's kind of the way you can build that segregation today and still offer that flexibility that people are looking for. Geez, you could even use a Chromebook and have them access, through HTML5 an RDP session in Windows Virtual Desktop, and have them work that way. I mean, regardless of what the use cases are, this is one way of solving it. It's not I click a button and it works. It's a lot of little steps that you have to go through. But once you've gone through the motions and you've done that, you can incrementally implement the system and get to a true zero trust based on data sensitivity.
Great. The last question before we wrap up is from Jaap. And Jaap has a so-called chicken and egg question about conditional access. Managed devices and MFA. A recommendation is to require MFA to join a registered devices to HAD. In conditional access, you can then exclude MFA on managed and/or compliant devices. But what to do with a mobile device where you're going to use the authenticator app on? Mostly this is also a device you want to manage. How to deal with that?
Yeah, good question. I mean, this is one of the things that comes up regularly, right? Securing a device or requiring MFA by registering a device in itself. Today, because it's the chicken and the egg problem. I mean, I don't have a great answer, because depending on how you look at it, it's either the chicken or the egg that was first. But preventing to use a non-managed device to use as or to use for your authenticator app today, because the authenticator app is a non-managed application, kind of creates that problem. Honestly, I look at it and I just accept the fact that things are the way they are. Not great, right? Not the panacea. And I just accept the fact that sometimes that doesn't work. I would love for the authenticator app to be managed, right? So that we can enforce certain things in there, so I can require certain conditions for it to be able to use that in terms of exempting MFA or using it as an MFA token, if you will. But if that today doesn't fit your needs, there's other ways that you can do MFA. Then maybe you should look, instead of using MFA, which you still have to register, is to focus more on passwordless authentication, which, by the way, if you do Hello for Business, it's MFA. It sets MFA in the token and therefore satisfies the problem that you're working with right here. But if you're still talking about MFA by actually you're performing a second action, a second gesture, if you will, then this is a limitation that we'll have to work with. Okay, so as we are
great.
Sorry, Kenneth?
Thanks for answering that question as well.
One more thing, for those who stuck around, not sure if everyone's still there or if they've all flown off, but for the ones that are there, I want to use this opportunity to announce a new book that I'm working on together with Peter Daalmans, Thomas Verweg, Thijs Leconte, and Amar Hazayan. We will be releasing later this month the M365 for IT Professionals ebook. It's a book that we will release in digital format only. We will maintain on a monthly basis, which means that each month we update the book, we add content, and we update content. And as you've all been listening to my ramblings for a little over an hour now, I think you have earned your copy of that book. So if you leave your email address with the organizers, then once the book has been released, we will send you your free copy your way. So thanks for that, and I wish all of you a great evening.
Great. Thanks, Michael. I will do the wrap up. If you have any feedback about this webinar, please let us know. It's quite a large link, but thankfully Peter already published a link in the Q&A as well. Please let us know some improvements, some other stuff. We want to do better each time, so feedback is really appreciated. Then we have next week, we have Mirko Kolenberg talking about desktop analytics. Go to www.wmug.nl in order to make sure that you are notified about the settings of that meeting taking place. And last but not least, again, we would like to thank our sponsors and of course, Michael, for taking the time to present for us. We have a recording available of this meeting, which we will publish on our YouTube channel later on. Again, Michael, thank you for your time. And I hope to virtually meet you again, maybe sometime in the future.
Absolutely, and thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks all.